now Anselm.
Hey, how are you?
Yes. Hey, good to see you.
Good.
Thanks so much for joining GLOSAIC today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I thought we would talk. Let's start with what it is that you're building. I have a bunch of questions for you, but because we've had some conversations, I think like people need to hear how you're thinking about SDK structure and things like that. But would love for you to share first, maybe just what is Jazz?
Yeah, so Jazz is a framework for front-end or full-stack devs to build apps that don't need a backend. The idea is that by being local first, which means that you keep all of the data that you need in the client and you can do permissions properly in the client, a lot of the responsibilities of a traditional backend kind of just evaporate. And instead of doing requests against the backend, waiting for the response, you can do everything locally in your front end. And then you basically just solve the problem of like, well, how do we sync data between participants or between your device and the cloud? But the infrastructure needed for that is much more general purpose, doesn't need to know anything about your app. So what Jazz really gives you is like auth, user identity, structured data, blob storage, all usable from the front end. And you can now build complete multi-user, multi-device apps that work offline, support really high fidelity real-time multiplayer using only front-end code. The pitch that I always give front-end developers is, imagine you just mock up an app around something like React use state. But if you then use Jazz instead, it magically just works and you have a fully working app. That's kind of what we set out to build Jazz like. What really surprised us is that actually makes it a really good target for generative AI. And I guess that's one of the topics you were curious to get into as well.
Yeah, can you let's go right into that. Why does that make it, why does it make it useful for specific categories like generative? I think even in the context of why should developers be thinking about running some of this stuff more, pushing this to the edge? And yeah, so maybe we can start with generative and we can kind of expand from there.
Oh yeah, sure. So I always saw this, the different way in which local first works, which we've really doubled down on with Jazz, also giving you like local first permissions as an unlock to reach like a much bigger audience of developers, where now a front-end developer without someone in the backend helping them, or a mobile developer without a backend team attached to that, can build whole apps. And I think the promise of like vibe coding and generative AI made me realize that I can take that a bit further, where now like a designer who can code a little bit and can use something like V0, they can actually build not just functional mockups, but fully functional apps. And the way it works well is basically because, that's my theory at least, we really designed Jazz to look familiar and like existing abstractions. So it's easy to pick up for humans. It doesn't try to look like this new and alien thing that it really is under the hood. It just tries to look like front-end state and tries to follow patterns that people already know. Well, turns out that also makes it easy for generative AI to just guess correctly how to use Jazz. The other big advantage is, well, you don't have a full stack anymore. You don't need to create a front end, a back end, set up a database, deploy them all somehow, integrate them with each other. It's just a single code base that you need to worry about. And for generative AI, that means a single output. They are very good at generating just the front ends. And with Jazz, that's kind of all they need to do to make a full app.
So, I mean, you said something in there that we've talked about before that I just want to really like zoom in on. When people think about what a developer experience, right? Like I want to make an SDK that developers understand how to use, the equivalent of UX, but for a coder. When we are lucky enough to have developers who have built that, it as a person using their code, it makes it a lot easier. And it almost seems inevitable that like the next generation of users of developer tools are generative AI. Versus, not in addition to human beings, and is building and a lot of people. I mean, I think we have like almost 5,000 people listening. I would imagine that many people are coding in some way. When you envision those users, is there a way that they differ from AI users, or can you actually kind of are there design patterns that you're thinking about that are non-obvious for building for generative AI, or is it just like make it easy, make it obvious, make it simple, and AI will understand it because people understand it?
I think like the big good news and big surprise was that actually the people and the generative AI tools need the same things, and many of the prior design decisions that we did to make it easy to use for humans really also make it easy to pick up for AI. But that means inversely, we can actually use the AI as a proxy for real humans as well, because it's often hard to get feedback from like a big community of developers, right? So what we're doing is setting up kind of automated evals where we're like, look, if we feed the documentation into a generative AI tool, and we really try to be like, we don't really do a separate thing for the AI. We pretty much derive our LLMs, text, our cursor rules directly from our handwritten documentation for humans. And then what we want to do is set up a system where we can track over time if it's getting better at generating Jazz apps, given like certain prompts or constraints. And that should actually give us a good measurable idea of how good are our docs, how good is the API design, how easy is it to guess, where does it make mistakes? And so far, what we've seen from just doing that manually, they are really very similar to the humans using Jazz or people using a mix of manual work and AI tools. So I'm really excited about that, and we're learning things from human feedback that makes it easier for AI and vice versa. And I'm really trying to take this to the extreme where I'm like, what if we made Jazz more like what the AI guessed it would be like, even without knowing anything about it? So one concrete example of that is like in Jazz, you define a schema to kind of describe the shape of your data, a little bit like you would do in a traditional database. Right now, we have this like very idiosyncratic custom schema that you need to learn to do so. But AIs kept guessing that they could just use Zod schemas with Jazz. And Zod is like a schema validation library that's like the most popular of its kind in the JavaScript ecosystem. AIs obviously know how to use it and really want to use it. Turns out lots of people know how to use it too. So we were like, why don't we just make that the schema syntax for Jazz? The AI just gets to do what it wants to do anyways. And people who know Zod already kind of know half of Jazz. So that's what we're currently working on. And I think that's a good example of why that's exciting to cater to.
I mean, just even the sentence, what does AI want to use? Like just giving it a verb want gives you, I mean, I thought about the direction going from, okay, make it really good for users and AI will be good at it, but actually using, it's almost like an eval, having AI suggest, okay, this is what I think I'm going to do with this, could probably also make your product better for human being developers to make something more intuitive.
Exactly.
Okay, so that, I mean, I think that's, there's a few other things I want to talk about in our short period of time. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to release Jazz open source and how you think about what the business model is? We talked a little bit kind of earlier on about this new generation of open source native business models.
Yeah, I think the way I've been thinking about Jazz from the beginning is really as a protocol first. I think it's like a very radical new way of building apps and thinking about apps that's inherently much more decentralized. The good news is it's not like a new protocol that you need to adopt with like a new browser or like a wallet. If you're thinking about crypto protocols or something like that, you can actually build it completely on top of existing web standards and build web apps with it that work in existing browsers. But it is a protocol first and foremost. So my intention is to make that open so that there can be other frameworks on top of it other than Jazz that are actually like data compatible with it. That's kind of the root of it. Jazz itself, I think like dev tools just need to be open source these days. That's like non-negotiable for me. The question is, can you make it work with a business model? And I think in our case, we're just very fortunate in that the incentives are very well aligned because most of the logic is now in your front end. That's what you're using the open source framework for. You do rely to some degree on their existing like centralized sync and storage infrastructure. that we provide as a service, you kind of don't want to roll that on your own. You can really benefit from the fact that that doesn't need to know anything about your app. We can have huge economies of scale and so on. We can co-develop the open source framework and make the infrastructure perform and scale really well with it. But we do provide an open source version of the Sync and Star server you can run yourself as well, because like not being locked in is super important for developers, especially when it's like a new kind of unproven company like us. It's important for proving certain security guarantees and so on. So I think in our case, there isn't a conflict. I'm very aware of other dev tools that have gone very open source in the beginning and then had to kind of like go back on that a bit, and that caused like controversies. I hope that it'll just be this nice, simple story for us going forward.
It's interesting. There's this, I mean, we were talking earlier, Flower had a kind of a similar point of view where it's not just, and actually maybe LanceDB to some degree too, it's not just that there's a hosted version, it's that the thing that is you're hosting is like relatively deep, complex infrastructure. It's not just, we can make this web enabled, which I think is, it's approaching being trivial now to take an open source product and make it, web enabled, but to put it online, but to scale something that has complex infrastructure does seem aligned as like a new kind of clear path. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, the infrastructure complexity is definitely one thing, and what's kind of nice for us as a moat, I guess, is like all of the logic that you can also see in the open source part. That's not really what our business depends on, right? Our business depends on the practical know-how and experience of running this at scale. Like, where do you host it and so on? One thing that we do that's kind of counterintuitive is we don't use traditional cloud hyperscalers like AWS or Azure or something like that. We actually rent our own servers and kind of optimize the whole stack from the metal to the top of our framework, which is something that, again, you could do in theory with the open source version, but you would have to figure out a lot yourself. And we can pay that forward in terms of the pricing that we can offer to users, the performance guarantees, and so on. So that's why I think there's just this beautiful synergy between the open source part containing all the logic and this kind of company built around the know-how of running the infrastructure. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, look, super. Thank you so much for joining. It's super interesting. I think, as you know, what you all are building, I think is it feels like the direction that a lot of developers are starting to take as they're building the new product. So real quickly, where can people go to try Jazz? Jazz.tools?
Just go to jazz.tools. That has everything you need.
All right. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.